Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Care Training through the Wisconsin Hawthorn Project. I think in nature metaphor. I think in pictures, and especially in pictures of nature or in natural ways of interacting. So that's really part of why the name came to be, the Wisconsin Hawthorn Project. The hawthorn is a very specific plant chosen to symbolize the heart of this initiative. And does anybody know anything about the hawthorn plant? So it's a bush. And it's actually native to the Great Lakes region. It's actually native to Wisconsin. This is a Wisconsin-specific initiative. And it has a few different metaphors enveloped in it. One is that the hawthorn simultaneously has really sharp thorns for protection, but its flowers, when it blooms, are also very tender, very delicate flowers. And those flowers develop into fruit. So they have these little red berries on them. And those berries end up nurturing many animals and insects and the community around them. Even though they have the capacity for protection, even though they also have tenderness, they also intentionally nourish the environment around them. One of the things specific to humans about the hawthorn is that the hawthorn, especially the berry, but other parts of the plant as well, are good for cardiovascular health and have also been traditionally used for the emotional heartache of cardiovascular experiences. So it's an emotional and physical medicine that's been used for a long time. I am going to start with a poem, actually, for you all. And one of the fun things for me is that I actually change the poems each training. So we get feedback about what is most effective for the community. So just take a moment, feel your feet on the ground. It only takes a reminder to breathe, a moment to be still, and just like that, something in me settles, softens, makes space for imperfection. The harsh voice of judgment drops to a whisper, and I remember again that life isn't a relay race, that we will all cross the finish line. That waking up to life is what we were born for. As many times as I forget, catch myself charging forward without even knowing where I'm going, that many times I can make the choice to stop, to breathe and be, and walk slowly into the mystery. Really just staying with this theme of slowing down and arriving, I'm going to guide you through a brief mindfulness activity. So again, just notice your feet. Notice your natural breath at this point. And shift your natural breath to intentionally breathing in through your nose. You can exhale however you want to, but in through your nose and exhaling. Just taking notice of your starting point today. Noticing the energy in your body. Noticing the things that might still be taking your mind outside of this room. And again, focusing on that nasal inhale. And a slow exhale. Bringing your awareness back into the room, expanding your awareness from self to include the external world as well. And noticing the shift from the picture on the screen and what the water is doing to what the water is doing in this picture. When it comes to trauma-informed care and working with trauma, one of the things that is hardest to do is to remain still. And in Japanese, there's a term called mizu no kokoro, which means a mind like still water. And my invitation to you throughout this training is to really use your own breath, to use your own body awareness, to use whatever strategies you have. For the people who are here in this room, there are sensory tools on each of the tables. You can trade them out. There are coloring pages inside your folders. There are different things that you can do to keep yourself present and to practice your own awareness, cultivating this sense of mizu no kokoro, because developing the capacity for stillness is one of the highest, most impactful things for staying present with and working with the pain that comes with trauma. But when it comes down to it, I will also really be focusing on two things. One is remembering. So one of the things that we know about trauma is that trauma induces the desire to forget. Dissociation is a major component of trauma, and we do that societally. The other thing that I'm going to be really focusing on is developing tolerance for pain, or developing the ability to lean into pain and be present with pain. So these are some of the logistical objectives, but underneath that, it's about being present with pain and about remembering. So Judith, in her book, Trauma and Recovery, which I believe is on the back table there, near the very beginning said, "To study psychological trauma is to come face to face both with human vulnerability in the natural world and with the capacity for evil in human nature. To study psychological trauma means bearing witness to horrible events. When the events are natural disasters or acts of God, those who bear witness sympathize readily with the victim. But when the traumatic events are of human design, those who bear witness are caught in the conflict between victim and perpetrator. It is morally impossible to remain neutral in this conflict. The bystander is forced to take sides. It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All that the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share in the burden of pain," which is quite uncomfortable. I don't know about you all, but I generally prefer not to experience a lot of pain. So that juxtaposition is a really good reminder for us about what does it mean to actually be getting curious about trauma-informed care and the prevalence of trauma in our society. The second quote is by Bessel van der Kolk and some of his colleagues about this concept of how systems, in this case the psychiatric system or the medical system, kind of borrowed that dissociative tendency of trauma. Psychiatry's amnesia about the importance of psychic trauma has taken the strange form of a repetition compulsion. Because of periodic denials about the reality of trauma's effects on the human soma and psyche, hard-earned knowledge has been repeatedly lost and subsequently rediscovered de novo. Whereas compassionate lay observers have always recognized that extreme life experiences can cause psychiatric illness, the medical profession has been capable of maintaining decades of denial about the reality of psychic trauma. In psychiatry, each generation seems to have needed to formulate psychological phenomenon in a new language, to find a contemporary voice, in keeping with the political tenor of the times. However, this does not foster a solid accumulation of knowledge or the development of an effective treatment repertoire. 100 years of research have shown that patients often cannot remember and instead reenact their dramas in interpersonal misery. The professionals attending to these patients have had similar problems with remembering the past. And thrice, so 3 times in this century, professionals have drawn a blank over the hard-earned lessons. So just to pause there, what they're referring to is that there was a lot of research done in the era of looking at shell shock. There was a lot of research about PTSD and war veterans in the First World Wars. And then we kind of stopped talking about trauma, and we didn't really treat trauma, and we didn't really look at it in other aspects. And then when the Vietnam War came around, then we started researching it again. And we're in this third phase right now where people are talking about trauma again and starting to go, okay, it's in war veterans, it's in rape survivors and sexual assault survivors. It's, okay, where are the places that trauma exists? So we're in this like third phase of considering remembering, and we have a lot of new language and a lot of new research around that. However, he continues, it is not likely that these amnesias and dissociations will be things of the past. They are likely to continue as long as we are faced with human breakdown in the face of overwhelming stress, which flies in the face of our inherent hubris of imagining ourselves as masters of our own fate, and as long as we need to hide from the intolerable reality of man's inhumanity to man. The desire, the need to dissociate is very strong in our psyche, and it permeates a lot of different things. So when I said that practicing mizu no kokoro, or practicing a mind like still water, is one of the most critical components of practicing trauma-informed care, it's really about this, because when we're faced with really intolerable pain, whether that's our pain or whether we're bearing witness to pain, there's an impulse to turn away. There's a like, oh, I'd rather not, in a lot of circumstances. Developing the capacity to lean back in and to remember and stay present with it is a little bit counterintuitive in several different ways. Part of that has to do with our neuropsychology and the way that our brains function, and part of it just has to do with muscle memory and how we've kind of taught each other as a society to turn away. Yeah. How many of you, when you go to the grocery store, somebody says, "How are you?" without actually caring how you are? Right? So we have social patterns of don't actually lean in. Don't actually check in with how you're feeling, not only when someone asks you, but definitely don't share it, right? There's different ways that we reinforce that unintentionally in our society. And that goes back far in history. So when I'm talking about trauma-informed care, when I'm working with this content is in the context of the United States in 2018, coming on 2019, that there is a history embedded in our experience here. So when we look at this particular map, which is a relatively new resource by native-land.ca about the historical indigenous territories on this continent. So there is a different sort of mapping of territory and of boundaries on this map than we often look at maps. And this is really important for us to look back on for several reasons. One, because the general concept of the United States or the Great Lakes area or Wisconsin often has an amnesia about the history of how we came to be here, how we came to have these boundaries. So inherently, our relationship with the land and our historical relationship with the land are embedded in our experience of trauma and how we regulate ourselves in place. Trauma is inevitable in a lot of ways, and we'll work through that in a little bit, but the way that we as a community learn how to recover from trauma and learn how to support each other through trauma is place-specific. The medicines and the things that people use develop from their relationship to the land as much as from their relationship to each other. And more specifically, in the Great Lakes region, These are some of the overlapping, I know it's hard to see, and your printouts also aren't, but these are the several different indigenous communities that knew this place as home and who had a ceremonial tradition with the plants here, and with the coming of European settlers, lost a lot of their access to their traditional ways of being, right? So when we start thinking about intergenerational and historical trauma, not only inflicted, but also that we are and our ancestors might have bared witness to, in this region, there were broken treaties. There were forced relocations. There were boarding schools that forced children to forget their language, their ceremonies, the way that they knew how to heal in community. And that history is not just relevant for the indigenous people that you might work with or collaborate with in your different agencies, but it's also relevant for how our own lineages or whatever your ancestry is in coming to being here in this room right now. What your own immigration lineage is, even if your particular family did not have a history connected to boarding schools or connected to forced relocation, those sorts of things. The reality is that most immigrants came to the United States trying to flee some sort of pain. There was a need and a desire for a better life. And you don't seek a better life if you've already got it going pretty well, right? So there is a particular kind of pain that is the foundation of this country. And there's a little bit of a different hue of it in this particular region. According to this map, there are 5 different overlapping territories in this particular region of Wisconsin. These are the ancestral people of where we are doing the training today. They are the Oseti-Sakowin or the Sioux, the Miami, the Ho-Chunk or Winnebago, the Menominee, and the Sauk and Meskwaki. So I do this intentionally, right? This might feel dry, it might feel really history-oriented, but it's also a microcosm of the way that we've forgotten and the way that we've turned away from the fact that trauma is not just right now. There's a lot of research about intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, and that is place-specific. So I do this at the beginning to help us orient to the greater perspective of doing this work. And it's uncomfortable. I know it's uncomfortable for me. So I don't know what your experience is now, but I'd invite you to check in, to notice what you're feeling, whether that's boredom or irritation or distractibility, or it might be interest or curiosity. Just note your feeling and be curious about how that's familiar to you, or how it's uncomfortable, or how it's comfortable. Just notice, because noticing those things will also help you pay attention to when you do and do not lean in to the pain that is inherent in trauma. Orienting is necessary for our sense of safety and our awareness of safety in our environment. So when we think about orienting, right. Okay, so anybody look over at the loud noise? Yeah, most people do. It's an automatic neurological hardwired response to orient to a potential threat. So our sensory abilities help us track the environment in that way. And that includes tracking each other. It's really difficult to track and be aware of a whole new group, a whole new space. And so it's a little bit easier for our brains to start one-on-one or to start paired or in a small group, and then orienting to your table, and then orienting to the whole group as well. Speaking of safety, it is important to create agreements or actually set some sort of standard in place not only in your workspace and in the work that you do, but in a training environment even, to have some baseline sense of safety. So there's a safe space image on here. A lot of places use the safe space sticker. It is used in LGBTQ spaces a lot, but it's been expanded to be used in a lot of different settings to say, regardless of your identities, regardless of the things that you're carrying with you, you're safe here. Unfortunately, some of the research about those safe space signs is that more experience of harm happens in those settings than in random and anonymous settings in some cases. And there's a couple of theories about that. One is that if I am working in a so-called safe space, I can forget. Right? I can have my own little moment of amnesia. I can check out and get a little bit lazy about my role in intentionally cultivating safe space and engaging in practices, right? And so I might not notice the ways that I'm unintentionally causing harm, especially if I'm tired or didn't get my coffee or whatever it is that might cause me to act out in an undesirable way. The other part of it is that when there's a safe space sign posted, somebody who experiences a lot of difficulty in their life, a lot of experiences of not being safe, might come in and just take off all of that armor, like, oh my gosh, thank goodness, I'm in a place where people will not hurt me. And then they stop engaging in the active process of maintaining their own safety. So safety is not a given in any circumstance. Safety is something that we're constantly practicing and cultivating. So for that reason, I actually call it brave space. Because being vulnerable, engaging in relationship requires some bravery. It acknowledges the fact that we will get hurt sometimes. That we can do our best to have a relationship where we will be as safe as possible with each other and we'll still hurt each other, right? So just assuming safety, it can be a dangerous concept in some ways, emotionally dangerous. So as far as co-creating a brave space, I use 5 different concepts. And these come from a book called Courageous Conversations About Race, but they're applicable in a lot of different contexts. I like them because it turns out that talking about race or oppression can be really uncomfortable. So the people who are having those conversations, having those difficult conversations, have really spent some time going, okay, what are our shared agreements that will actually help us stay in this conversation instead of wanting to, again, turn away from that difficulty. So the first one is stay present. What does it mean to you all to stay present?
My name is Norma. I think to stay present is to stay out of your own thoughts and to stay out of it and to continue to interact in the present moment instead of thinking about, okay, did I turn on the coffee pot? What's for supper tonight? To be there.
So to keep coming back to this moment, as many things might want to pull us away from it.
As many times as you have to, but to stay.
Right. Anything else about staying present?
My name's Matt, and I would say to touch into that as well, to remove your personal experiences, because that may not affect the person that's, opening up to you in the same way.
So suspending judgment a little bit, like pressing pause on this is the lens that I have because of my experience, and engaging with some curiosity around something that somebody else is presenting. Thanks. Anything else about staying present? The only thing I would add is that so like those cards at the beginning, there's a quote, some of them are kind of inspirational or supportive, and then there's a statistic. Staying present also acknowledges that it's exhausting to stay present all the time, and that cultivating presence means consciously touching and going. It means consciously saying, and now I'm going to stand up and stretch, and I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to drink some water. I grew up in rural South Dakota next to the Lakota Sioux tribe, and my elders there always remind me that water is the first medicine. And there's a fair amount of science actually about the regulating impact of swallowing and having fluid enter our system. Our bodies also just need fluid in order to find homeostasis, in order to regulate. Staying present might be coloring, it might be going to the bathroom, it might be, whatever it is for you, that there's also permission for you to take care of yourself, especially if you get triggered or if you're struggling in some sort of way. And that includes the fact that I have no idea what sort of histories you all have, what sort of what your home situation was this morning or last night when you left, that there are factors that I will not be able to mitigate for you, right? And that goes back to your role of doing what you need to balance that you have a life outside of here and you came here to enter into this work. The next one is expect non-closure. What does that mean to you all?
Thanks, Sarah, for them. When I see that, I think don't expect to wrap everything up and solve all of the things in all of the moments. Like it's not going to be figured out or cleaned up every time. Sometimes you're going to have to kind of leave the window or door open for further conversation.
Right. Anything anybody wants to add?
Thanks, Rebecca. That nobody owes you their full story. That they don't have to actually tell you everything, and you don't have to know all the backstory or ask all the questions to like get at. Well, this happened and that happened and this happened, and nobody owes you actually any of that.
Right, that even though confusion or not knowing can be really uncomfortable, that doesn't obligate somebody else to fill in those gaps for us. Yeah. So not only non-closure in the relationships in this room, but the non-closure of working with trauma mitigation. Again, the microcosm and the parallel process of what's happening in the big picture is also happening in the smaller relationships. Anything else anybody wants to add about non-closure? Okay, so trauma is as old as time, right? And it takes on different forms, and we track it in different ways. But even though there's some part of us that can show up to a training going, okay, I hope I can find that magic pill, that trick that's going to make it really be so much easier in my work. It's a constant practice. It's a constant process, and that's true for the Wisconsin Hawthorn project in general, that what I'm working with and what I'm supporting is the practice and the process more than a product. Okay? The next one is experience discomfort. We've got somebody ready to go. What does it mean to experience discomfort and have that as an agreement?
Hi, I'm Carrie Howard. I think that it kind of speaks to what you were saying earlier, the idea of not wanting and trying to back away from things. Experiencing discomfort means that you have to be able to understand that that's part of the process. I talk a lot to people about things hurt, and you have to have that hurt. You have to go through it. You can't medicate it, you can't push it away. You have to experience it in order to keep walking through and get to the other piece of it. So as much as I'm counseling other people to do that, I also have to be willing to sit in my space and allow that to happen as well, so I can be there and more present with that person.
Beautiful, thank you. Any additions to that?
Sarah Fludum again. So just to add to what you were saying, I think it also says to me that you need to embrace it in a way that's acknowledging you're going to have uncomfortable conversations. Like a mentor once said to me, you experience growth with discomfort. So if you aren't uncomfortable in something, you're not necessarily learning about yourself and what makes you uncomfortable, and you're not leaning into it. So
Beautiful, thank you. One more.
My name is Tommy, and I just also want to share that when we're working with people that are living trauma, that is traumatic for us. And it's important to be able to be present with somebody you're working with, and also, after you're done, to address the trauma that you have received vicariously from that person.
Absolutely. So playing with this, again, this weaving, this overlapping of the fact that the only way out is through, right? Like that's a mantra that I've gotten from some of my mentors, and especially in the hero's journey concept, that the only way out is through, and when we interrupt or try to rescue or try to change the fact that it's painful, we don't actually get to the other side. We don't get to integrate that learning. It ends up being interrupted and can then also just cause it to repeat until it does get to sequence all the way through to the learning part. So yes, there's the only way out is through. There's a requirement to stay present. There's a need to do that, and it's difficult. It's so difficult, right? And then that brings us back to the stay present, especially in the context of this can be vicariously traumatic, either because we have similar experiences in our own lives, or because it's just painful to bear witness to the type of pain that people are experiencing. And how do we discharge it? How do we regulate? How do we come back to speaking our truth that this is really, really hard work, and we can't afford to pretend that it's not hard work. The other thing that I would say about this is that it's just provocative and evocative content, right? Even if we don't have a panel of people telling us their most horrific stories, talking about trauma and the connections that your brains already have to your own lived experiences and to what you've heard from other people, it brings up a lot, it moves a lot. And again, you are the only one who really knows how much of that is moving inside of you and what you might try to do to work with it, to stay present or to let it discharge. The last one is honor the author. This is not a confidential space. We have a videographer here for one, but for two, even though I'm a trained therapist and a licensed therapist in Wisconsin, we're not trying to do a group process here. We can heal and have moments of healing and insight even in a training, but confidentiality is not a fair expectation. However, honoring the author can be. So what does it mean to honor the author of who's sharing experiences?
My name's Norma. I'd like to honor the author would be if you picked up something or learned something from somebody's personal experience, that you can share what you've learned or what you took away from the conversation, just to not throw their name underneath the bus, to say, just to leave them separate from what you learned, and you can carry on what you learned. Just leave them.
Great, thank you. So keeping names separate and really focusing on what I learned from it. Especially if you have coworkers here, like this, we're trying to cultivate a space where you can be brave, where you can share some vulnerability, and if there's a risk of that being thrown back at you in some sort of way, then we're not practicing it, we're not embodying what trauma-informed care means, and we're also then recapitulating, repatterning those patterns of trauma as well. Any other comments about these 5 agreements?
Hi, this is Rebecca. One thing I just keep thinking about is that, especially when we're working with our clients, that we are sometimes the ones who are about to cause the discomfort. Mm-hmm. And so I think that thinking about, like we've kind of been talking about feeling discomfort when people are talking or when we're having difficult conversations, but I think sometimes it's that like gearing up to jump off and not knowing like the pathway through, and that you are about to cause that, mm-hmm. and then have to like hold it afterwards too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's, especially in a mental health context, right? But it happens in most of the contexts because mental health and trauma bubbles up everywhere we go. But especially in a mental health context where you're saying, you're here to work on this, you're here to move through it. Yeah, we we stir the pot a little bit. Not because we're necessarily causing harm, but because we're shining light on the things that people would prefer to turn away from. And calling them back into presence about the reality of their lives can be scary and difficult for sure. Any other comments before we move on? Any other practices or group agreements that you all use in your spaces or your groups or with your clients? Anything that you would want to change about these ones? Okay, so, and this is, I find them to be pretty comprehensive. They're pretty concise, they overlap in pretty seamless ways, and it's just one resource, right? So, and the Wisconsin Hawthorn project is one resource. So on the right side of your folder is additional resources. On the front side are national resources, and on the back side are Wisconsin-specific resources. Wisconsin, as you may know, is aiming to be the first comprehensively trauma-informed state. So there's a lot of resources out there besides this, and I'm sure you all have various degrees of exposure to those, and even if you don't, there's a reminder that you have access to them. Experience shapes who we are. One of the books that really encapsulates this well from a parenting or relationship perspective is Parenting from the Inside Out by Dan Siegel, and I'm forgetting the co-author's name, but the book is back there. And experience influences how our brain wires. Experience influences how we think of ourselves. So one way to think about this is the way that we are with our children is how our children come to be with themselves. The input that we have influences our neural connections. So there's two ways that this happens. One is that when input happens, when we're getting the stimulus, our neurons will grow. We'll develop networks, we'll develop connections that say, oh, when the light turns green, that means go. When the light turns red, that means stop. From the input, red and green are pretty arbitrary colors for a stoplight, but we've developed those connections. We wire those connections, and we have those associations. The other way that this happens is through neural pruning, and that happens by if you don't use it, you lose it sort of framework, right? So most little babies are inherently wired for a lot of different things. One of the things is that we're pretty inherently wired for language. So babies, newborns, have the capacity to develop any language. They can pick up and acquire any type of phoneme or phoneme sequence. But if they're not exposed to it, their brain prunes that away. It says, this isn't relevant skill, this isn't relevant information, I'm not going to do it. And that goes into the next one, that relationships are the crux of trauma-informed care, and relationships influence experience. So some of the research about language and language acquisition is that you can have a child, for example, in an English-speaking environment and play Japanese TV and Japanese music and Japanese, all sorts of electronic versions of language in Japanese, and the brain will still prune away Japanese phonemes as a relevant thing to know, because it's not happening in relationship. That the relationship of language is wired together with the experience. If you're not speaking Japanese to me, then my brain says, not relevant for my environment, I'm going to learn what you're speaking, and that's more important to me. Relationships being the crux of trauma-informed care. We are hurt in relationship and we are healed in relationship. Relationship. I will come back to that over and over, especially because relationship is practice. And the way that I like to talk about this is relationship across difference. Okay? So whether the difference is gender, or whether the difference is the type of trauma you've experienced, or whether the difference is the type of framework that you've been trained in, relationship across difference is a constant, ongoing practice. And even if you're familiar with the role of relationship in healing and healing from trauma, we all need more practice, and we all have different types of situations that trigger us and go, oh, I don't really want to engage in that, where we block ourselves, where we protect ourselves, where we turn away from relationship and cut off. And in those moments, we're not available to engaging in healing in ourselves or supporting the healing process in somebody else. Behavior is communication. So this goes back to the crazy comment before, or when people are acting in ways where we're like, that just doesn't make any sense, it's problematic. We have lots of labels for it: criminal behavior, psychotic behavior. We use these things colloquially even as negative labels, but behavior is communication. Behavior is a statement at the very least about how people are or are not regulated. Behavior shows us how we're coping with our experience of the world. And in that sense, behavior is an attempt at regulation. So a kiddo might go from sitting in their seat, paying attention in class, to writhing on the floor uncontrollably. And for a teacher or somebody supporting a learning environment, that might be really crazy making and really irritating. And it's like, ugh, like why this happens so fast? And there's all sorts of judgments and frustrations that can come up around that block us from that experience. But if we step back, we might see, okay, something's happening. There's some sort of attempt to regulate. The kid is getting sensory input from the floor. The kid is, it might not be our preferred strategy that they use, but there is an attempt to find regulation, and you only know the coping skills that you know, right? And every single person's body copes differently. The type of sensory input that is soothing for me is probably different than the sensory input that would be soothing for you. And even in the behaviors that appear to be bizarre, there is a seeking of comfort or a seeking of familiarity that we do, especially when we're young, and especially in family contexts, because family contexts, even if they're emotionally violent or physically violent in some sort of way, they're familiar enough that we think that they're safe. We behave our most authentic, most raw in our family context most of the time. And so we'll see that in those contexts especially. The next one is that humans tend to be pleasure-seeking and pain avoidant. Anybody resonate with this? Yeah. We do this in so many ways. We fantasize about vacations. We're also pain avoidant. One of the things that is very true about our society is that we are very drawn to pain medications, right? We have all sorts of different anti-inflammatories and pain medications that block our experience of pain as much as possible, and have ultimately really influenced the opioid epidemic in the country and in the state, because having ways to block pain is alluring. And unfortunately, from a trauma-informed care perspective, using those methods, especially using them habitually or compulsively, also causes us to interrupt the healing process, causes us to interrupt the process of going into the pain that will then help us learn from the pain. The next one is that trauma and oppression are inherently connected. And this one might not be super obvious to people, but oppression is a type of trauma. And I say that from the baseline sense of oppression. From the baseline sense of relationship being critical for our sense of belonging and sense of self in a community. So the Jewish theologian Martin Buber wrote about this concept of the I-thou relationship. And he talked a little bit about the I-it relationship, meaning that we can kind of toggle back and forth between like really seeing the humanity or the value or the essence of another person or being, and then objectifying them. So the switch from like you are whole in and of yourself to you're a thing, right? And one of my mentors has kind of modified that to saying that if we switch to an I-it relationship, if we switch to objectifying or judging, that we are inherently objectifying and judging ourselves in that moment as well. That if I put somebody on a pedestal or if I put them beneath me, either way I'm losing touch with my own humanity and denying the ways that I am reflected in those people. So then it's an it relationship. And that separation, that self-denial of my own humanity, or the objectification that reduces my ability to see the humanity in these other people, regardless of whether I put them above me or below me, is inherent in the ability to cause harm to other people. And we know this especially from the way that war veterans talk about the war crimes or the acts that they do in war contexts that they would not do under other circumstances. They say, the only way I could kill those people was by not thinking of them as human, right? And that's a really obvious sense, but we do that in microscopic ways as well. This last one, we all cause harm. This is a really hard one for us to swallow, especially in helping professions. Most helping professions have really evolved from the Hippocratic Oath and the concept of first do no harm. We have this really lofty ideal that because we are in a helping profession, because we're good people, because of whatever those labels are, that we won't ever cause harm, and that's not realistic. And that's, again, that's a distancing of self from the reality of our whole human capacity. And those beliefs can kind of get in our way of staying present with the pain that helps us really embody and incorporate trauma-informed care in our workplaces. I've spent a big part of the day front-loading concepts, framework, a little, orienting to each other and to space. And I do that because, especially when talking about trauma and oppression, especially when talking about this degree of pain, it takes a little while to warm up and to find self in this context. It would be unfair of me to ask you to go into the intimacy of this content without really giving you some frameworks, without really letting you orient to the space. And so there's another framework that I'm going to go into now called the 4 Eyes of Oppression. I know Karen is familiar with this because I've co-presented it with her, and I know Caitlin is familiar with this. Anybody else familiar with the 4 Eyes of Oppression? Okay, so I use this framework because, partly because it's open source. The group who created it doesn't claim credit for it. It's just available. So it's your next handout is like a elaboration of the 4 Eyes of Oppression. And I also use it because of this principle, the underlying framework that I said, that oppression and trauma go hand in hand. So if it's easier for you to think of this as the 4 eyes of trauma, that you go ahead and do that. But it starts with ideology, or the ideological level of trauma and oppression. So I like to think of this as this is the air that we breathe that inhibits relationship, that ruptures our ability to be present, that interferes with our access to our humanity and our vulnerability. So the ideological components of oppression, for example, are the things that we're really familiar with that we don't even think about. So I'm going to say a couple of prompts, and if you know how to finish them, just yell them out into the space. Women belong in the... Women should be seen and not... Right. So we can do those things pretty quickly. Boys never... Okay, so those are some gender-specific examples of how we dehumanize regardless of gender. Boys, of course, cry. Women have lots of places that we belong and can engage with, right? So that's a gender-specific example, but it goes across all other traits and how we dehumanize each other, how we think of each other as other, right? So when we think of the criminal justice system and we think of the term criminal, who is the image that comes into your mind? You might not be proud of it, but is there an archetype? Is there a particular demographic that comes to your mind when you think of criminal? Male. What else? African American black male.
Oh, mine's like a white, kind of like a math user.
A white meth user comes to mind. Yeah, so again, experience shapes who we are. We have different inputs in different parts of the state based off of our upbringings, but we have archetypes of how we think of other people that influence the policies that we make. So the ideology is the overarching framework that is most common to 21st century United States of America, or in this case, specific to Wisconsin, and where we are here. So when we think about how our thoughts, and especially people who are in power, their thoughts, influence their institutions, so this influences the policies that we create and the frameworks that we have around access to resources, access to relationship, that sort of thing. What are some of the policies, what are some of the institutions that reinforce these dehumanizing ideologies? Media. Yeah, so in the media, different people are portrayed in archetypal ways. Yeah, certain demographics are more common to be the villain, right? Or more common to be sexualized than others, right? What other institutional ways do we reinforce this ideology?
Education system.
The education system. Are you willing to speak more to that?
I think both in like how curriculum are formed and like who's portrayed historically as kind of the villain versus like hero, and also it just kind of plays out in like who's included and excluded in the classroom and like who is disciplined and how.
Yeah, who is disciplined how, who is reinforced how. There's a lot of research that shows that when little boys raise their hands in class, that they're called on, that they're reinforced for that, and that little girls aren't as much. And so as kids develop through the educational system, you start to see more of a disparity of the degree of participation based off of a gender divide. One of the other research things that has been coming out lately is that schools have been more commonly incorporating restorative justice systems, and is restorative justice a thing here?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. I was pretty sure it was, but some of the research about restorative justice has shown that because of these unaddressed, unconscious, unnamed ideologies that we hold, the air we breathe without really thinking about it, even in a mindful environment of restorative justice, that kids are punished more severely for minor crimes when they are Black or Latino or a boy in some certain circumstances than when they are white for major crimes. So there is some research showing that, for example, if a white boy brings a gun to school, that his punishment from a restorative justice system might actually be the same for a Black kid who steals a pack of pencils. So the concept of restorative justice is really good, but we don't actually have an embedded system to really reflect on the bias that we're holding and how we dole out punishment It's this process of going from what we think, but especially from the people who have power and what they think, to creating rules around it. And not necessarily having a lot of conscious thought or pulling apart why those rules are the way they are at this point in time, because they're old rules, they're old systems at this point. So we think about it, we create rules about it, and then we enact it on each other. So most of the time when we talk about trauma-informed care or trauma, we're often only thinking about the interpersonal level of trauma, that like this person did this thing to that other person, right? This is true often for the way that mass shootings, including the one that just happened last night, happen. This is often the focus of the research around trauma. The types of trauma that we spend money on to research are often interpersonal ones, more than evaluating the institutional or ideological impacts of how we interact with each other. One other thing that I would say about this is often we think about this from across difference. So I said relationship across difference earlier. Trauma across difference is very common, but interpersonal oppression and interpersonal violence happens on the same side of demographics as well. So again, using gender as an example, this is when I was in high school and my female friends would say, "Why don't you ever wear your hair down? Don't you want to be pretty?" I happen to have some skin sensitivities, so not only do I not really like wearing makeup, it irritates my face to an excessive degree, and so I wouldn't wear makeup. And similarly, those girls would say, "Don't you want to be pretty? Wear some makeup. No one will ever date you if you don't." Right? So there's the beauty standards, the expectation of how we present across gender rules or based off of ideological components of beauty standards. We reinforce that in each other once we think it and have rules around it long enough. Going back to this underlying principle that we're pleasure seeking and pain avoidant, that is even stronger in most cases when a parent or a caregiver is thinking about their child. More often than not, adults will say, "I want my kid to have a better life than I did. I don't want them to experience what I did." And if some sort of difference shows up that societally is not valued, there's an impulse, there's a parent instinct, really, to want to protect the kid from that. And working with that can be really tricky because it's simultaneously true that pain and violence is disproportionately distributed to different demographics. So it is true that especially for a gender nonconforming boy, so a little boy who shows feminine characteristics, and does anybody have that stat, actually? So according to a study done by the Harvard School of Public Health, gender nonconforming children who are assigned male at birth are 300% more likely to be sexually assaulted. So it's true. Like it's a real fear. And it's not about minimizing that parental impulse to say, "I don't want my kid to be treated violently because they're different in this way." And this unintentional, don't be yourself, don't be authentic, that again creates that rupture from relationship both within self and in the family, that also creates a micro trauma in some sense. Ways in which we tell people to not be authentic are quite harmful. And then we start internalizing these things, right? Coming back to the concept of experience shapes who we are, and how we are with our children is how they come to be with themselves. When you're covertly and overtly reminded that feminine people are supposed to be a certain way and are not as valued in certain ways, then that belief system can become unconsciously or consciously internalized. So one of the ways that we see this is that when an application for a high-level position or a promotion is up, it is women are likely to only apply for that if they know that they meet all of the criteria, whereas men might not meet all of the criteria and will still apply, right? So the belief of like, even if I'm not qualified according to those standards, darn it, I'm qualified and I'm good enough. And it's really hard work to say I'm valuable and I'm worthy as I am, even if the ideology and the institutions and the people are telling me otherwise. It is hard work to reintegrate and see yourself as whole when that is happening. It weaves in and out, and again, this is intimate work. This is vulnerable and sensitive content and sensitive patterns that we're dealing with that we all engage in from a recipient and from an inflictive stance. And we all do it, especially because it's hard to be conscious of all of it all of the time. So that's why I love this quote by Lilla Watson. Some of you might know it. It came really from an Aboriginal rights community in Australia. And the quote is, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." That there is a co-healing, there's a collective process of engaging with somebody else's humanity when it's been stripped of them in some sort of way that helps us access our humanity as well. So these are the 4 eyes of oppression. I add 2 other layers onto this because what you'll see as you bring this into your agencies, if you decide to do that, is that people will go, well, that doesn't apply to me. That doesn't apply to me because I had a single mom and I respect women so much, and so this isn't relevant. So you might have a family experience that kind of alters it or shifts your experience of this, but that doesn't change the pervasive, dominant air that we breathe. That doesn't make the policies that are embedded in our systems any different. You just might have a little bit of a different family experience. One of the other things that can, from a family perspective, is the degree of acculturation. So if you are from a family who recently immigrated, or if you're a first-generation child, this can get really interesting and really wonky. One of the things that I see in working with children of immigrant families is that the children acculturate faster than the adults do, and then there's a really big conflict here because the children might be accidentally adopting a lot of these frameworks that will then oftentimes really conflict with cultural values that immigrants are coming in with, and not really having a framework for finding that middle ground and explaining why there's a value clash happening. And then there's personality, and we all have our own personal experiences. So one of the other things that I've heard is, well, I'm a really sensitive man. So there's no way that I also engage with this. And personality is a mitigating factor. It influences lens and it influences how we show up. And it still doesn't change the systems and the ideology and the patterns that our society has learned. They overlap. Trauma can be defined as a type of toxic stress. Unfortunately, there isn't a universally accepted definition of trauma. And that is partly because trauma is subjective. So I have a few different definitions that I like. The SAMHSA definition of trauma is that individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that has been experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So it's multifaceted. It impacts multiple parts of our lives. From a nervous system perspective, this can kind of be boiled down, and believing that behavior is communication, this can be boiled down to things that overwhelm somebody's ability to cope. And when we think about this in a family context, or when we think about this in working with children, This is especially true because children haven't learned how to cope, right? So they're more vulnerable to big stressors, to traumatic events, because they haven't developed all of those skill sets that might help them discharge or regulate or learn from a really difficult event or circumstance. Our bodies are designed to be able to respond to stress, but really in moments. That stress, the hormones that we have that help us deal with stress are supposed to be able to be metabolized and discharged and to be able to return us back to a homeostasis. But if we're constantly exposed to high stressors, or if we're repeatedly exposed to trauma, then those stress hormones stay sequencing, or they show up in different ways in the way that we stay awake kind of obsessing at night, that sort of thing. And it's a good reminder of how the way our behavior can be a sign for us about how we haven't been metabolizing our stressors, about how we haven't been working with our difficulties. It's also subjective. So I said that already, but I want to read one more definition of trauma, and it's that the body, mind, spirit's response to a real or perceived life-threatening situation that does not fully sequence through your body. So I'm going to read it again. The body, mind, spirit's response to a real or perceived life-threatening situation that does not fully sequence through your body. Why does it not matter whether it's real? Why can't it just be perceived? Where's the mic?
Hi, this is Tommy, and it's because a person's perception is their reality.
A person's perception is their reality. Right, so this is really important because one of our favorite ways, I know for myself personally, is to judge people because their perception isn't as good as my perception. Right? Like, you shouldn't actually be having a trauma response right now, get over it. That sort of, there's a protective factor in ourselves that helps us distance from somebody else's perceived reality. This is from SAMHSA. SAMHSA really outlines trauma in 3 layers, that there's an event or a series of events, like this is the thing that was difficult, whether that was the fire alarm, whether that was the divorce, there's all sorts of different things, right? And the image here is a divorce image because that is often experienced as very traumatic for several reasons, one of which being that children reference the adults in their life for their sense of safety. And when the emotional safety between those adults is changed or unstable, that can be experienced as information that life is not safe. Okay? Or if there's a removal of one of those people, you're removing, often in a lot of circumstances, half of that child's reference system for whether they're safe in the world or not. And that can be very unsettling. So there's an event, which we already acknowledged can be perceived differently based off of different people. So then there's an experience. And the experience of that is influenced by many, many factors. It's influenced by age. It's influenced by coping mechanisms. It's influenced by whether there was any front loading to that situation or not, or any talk about it. So some families will talk about with kids about how to really maintain a consensual environment when it comes to sex or sexual activity. Some do not talk about that. And when confronted with a non-consensual sexual experience, that different degree of talking about it, that prior exposure, might influence the experience of that event. And then there's the effects. So that's the social, emotional, spiritual, behavioral, relational impacts of the event itself. Has anybody had the experience where you started involuntarily shaking after or during a stressful experience? Yeah. I actually do this when I'm doing my final edits the day before a presentation. I'll shake during that. And I can judge myself, or I can like tell myself that I'm stupid or overreacting, but I know that it's a stress response actually, that there's enough cortisol, that there's enough stress hormones surging through my body, that my body needs a way to discharge it in order to find some regulation again. Okay? So when it comes to trauma and how we cope with trauma, I'm going to get into this a little bit more later, but our hindbrain, our survival brain, really influences that. So most people have heard of fight, flight, freeze, I'm guessing. And then there's also faint and fawn. Okay? Our hindbrain is also responsible for rest and digest. So the like autonomic, the things that keep us alive. But when it comes to moderating trauma, we generally go in that order of those fight, flight, freeze, faint, fawn options, generally. So, and it happens in microseconds, where our body assesses, we orient to the situation, that's why we orient, so that we can assess, can I fight and win? Can I fight and survive? If our assessment really rapidly goes, no, that will increase my risk, then can I flee and survive? If my assessment says no, tiger equals more chase, then I will say, okay, can I freeze and survive? And in a wild animal environment, we have a lot of metaphors, a lot of modeling for how to let ourselves discharge that freeze, because the freeze has a lot of energy in it. It's very energized to be in a freeze. That's why a lot of people in a trauma state might be able to recall precise details about the experience, because there's a hyper-awareness, there's a hyperactivity, and an immobility that goes with it. And the immobility is the classic component of the freeze. Immobility is not inherently dangerous or frightening, though. So there's a process of uncoupling that immobility from fear. So for example, if you see a cat carrying a little kitten, the kitten will be totally limp and immobile, but that can be a very pleasurable experience. So it's working with the body and the way that the body experiences the stress that is important. And then fawn is the last option. Fawn is the experience of going belly up, and it's actually often an attempt to diffuse the conflict or the potential stressor. So the example of this is if you see a couple of dogs playing and one starts to get really aggressive and the other one goes, hey, there's my visceral, like just if you're gonna tear it out now. Because I swear I'm not a threat. I'm so much not a threat that you can disembowel me and it's fine, right? It's a strategy for trying to diffuse the situation. Fawning is a little bit more common in same species interactions. So some part of my hindbrain knows that if I'm being attacked by a bear or being attacked by an animal that's bigger, faster, stronger than I am, that like just going eat me is probably not my best survival strategy. Like the fetal position is going to be much more protective, and we know that. There's intergenerational trauma. There's intergenerational wounding, but there's also intergenerational wisdom and survival strategies that we've come out with. Trauma inherently disintegrates. So disintegrates, it disrupts, it separates, I have a lot of synonyms in here because I think they're really helpful. It fractures or it fragments our experience. And that goes back to the 4 eyes of oppression and the dehumanizing, the not being able to be whole that happens. So if trauma disintegrates our sense of safety, it disintegrates our sense of belonging, then the process of integrating and having policies and practices in relationship where we integrate safety, where we integrate belonging, where we integrate dignity and purpose in the relationships that we have, that will create some different systems and structures for working with trauma when people show up in a disintegrated or fractured way. So the CDC has a stat that, and the statistic when they look at people under 18 or over 18 is actually the same, that 1 in 5 people, both children and adults, in any given year will develop a mental health crisis. And that one person, that 1 out of 5, is not the same person every time. So it's not just like that one out of 5 people is crazy. It's 1 out of 5 people often are having psychological symptoms as a result of the type of stressors that they're exposed to. And when we think about the severity of the stressors, the severity of the trauma exposed that people have, and the behaviors or the circumstances that we find them in, it can be 90% of kids in corrections, 90% of people seeking behavioral health. And here's another statistic from the 2012-2013 needs assessment by DHS here in Wisconsin. 98% of youth, so in Wisconsin, they found that 98% of youth in the juvenile justice system had experienced trauma as of 2013. According to one study by Goodman et al., 97% of homeless women with mental illness have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse. Right, so the correlation is actually really high, which is really important, especially when we think about how we avert from engaging with people who are homeless, or how we avoid volunteering at homeless centers or food pantries or that sort of thing, right? As far as the pleasure-seeking, pain avoidance tendencies that we have, it's not just our aversion to being unkempt or the different behaviors that show up. It's also our aversion to the pain that is embedded in those bodies when we interact with those people. Because when it comes down to it, trauma interrupts relationships. Whether that is because we are minimizing it because we don't want to witness it, or whether that is because of the pattern to just recapitulate what we've experienced when it hasn't been sequenced, when we haven't integrated, when we haven't learned from our experience, we reenact it. So hurt people, and that's not a really good recipe for being in relationship with others. And there's a lot of types of trauma. So here's a list of types of trauma. It's not really comprehensive, but it's it's covering a lot of bases. What is the difference between historical and intergenerational trauma?
Intergenerational is more directly within your lineage, where historical is within a general population.
Right. Yeah, so a historical trauma is a society-wide event, like the Holocaust or boarding schools, for example. Whereas intergenerational trauma is when a traumatic experience goes down from generation to generation. So we see this in statistics that there's a high correlation between addiction in a parent and eventual addiction in a child, or patterns of domestic violence and violence being committed later in life as well. What is the difference between developmental trauma, attachment trauma, and early childhood trauma?
I think about it in terms of within the context of a relationship versus something that happened when you were a young age.
Great. So developmental trauma could be things that happen as you're developing that interrupt your development or starkly change how you would have developed otherwise. Attachment trauma is specific to the parent-child relationship or caregiver-child relationship. And then early childhood trauma, one of the things that it goes with the developmental trauma concept as well, but sometimes they're separated based off of the age. So developmental capacities are way differently impacted in a 1.5-year-old who experiences severe trauma and a 9-year-old who experiences severe trauma, because the stage that you're at when you experience trauma influences the coping skills and your ability to verbalize it. The pre-verbal traumas have really different impacts than when kids already have the capacity to speak or have words for their experience. Medical trauma, I want to spend a little bit of time on that. Thoughts on what would be included under the medical trauma umbrella. Medical experiences where our bodies fail us or betray us, right? There's different circumstances where we would feel that way. Like cancer can be one, surgeries can be another one, that sort of thing, can have a medical trauma. But there's also relationships in the context of getting medical treatment. There are people doing these procedures, and unfortunately, a lot of them are not really trained in trauma-informed care and have pretty sophisticated ways of not bearing witness to that pain, not staying present with the discomfort, partly because of what we were talking about before, that having to know and be conscious of the fact that I might be causing someone else pain, I might be causing suffering, even if I don't want to be, even if my intention is to help them heal, can be very difficult to conceptualize and work with. Medical trauma also overlaps with societal institutional traumas, right? So one of the examples that I have of this is the fact that in our medical history, there was a point where research was specifically conducted on black men. One of those research studies was injecting black men with syphilis and letting it run its course, not treating them, letting them have the most severe symptoms, right? And that was a very traumatic experience for those people, even by the time that some of them did get treatment. There has also been a historical pattern of involuntary sterilization of people when they've gone in for medical procedures. That there's a lot of documentation of this being done to Native women, to poor women who have multiple children, to deaf women, to people that, for whatever reason, are judged as not being appropriate for procreating. Again, based off of the ideologies and the ways that we dehumanize each other. And that history, as a historical sense, is also very traumatic. So when we think about the low rates of seeking medical help in certain demographics, and we consider that history, it gives us a little bit of a different lens. There's also vicarious and secondary trauma. What are the differences between vicarious and secondary trauma?
Vicarious trauma is the trauma that you experience when somebody is sharing their story with you, where secondary trauma would be trauma that you tend to experience as a witness to a traumatic experience.
Right, so in being in helping professions, hearing somebody else's story can induce some of those trauma symptoms in ourselves. Whereas secondary trauma is where we are secondarily impacted by the event that happens. So for example, if your child experiences sexual assault, then the trauma of knowing that you, for example, one of the things that will show up is like, I failed to protect my child from this experience. There's a secondary trauma experience that can happen in direct relationship to an event that happens, or into witnessing event. Witnessing a car accident, not being in it, but witnessing it can also, you were there and can have some secondary impacts. These are a bunch of terms, a bunch of experiences that are not, they don't have the word trauma on them, but are experienced in traumatic ways often. And one of the things that I want to point out there is the abrupt, uncontrollable change. So whether that's a natural disaster, whether that is a car accident, something like a parent, for example, maybe you weren't there, but a parent being in a car accident and becoming a paraplegic, that's a pretty radical life change. And that even if you have coping, even if you have skills to adapt to that, it can be kind of like your story earlier about your child starting his life story from the divorce. That was a pretty something that he couldn't control and impacted his life as a big change. I'm going to give you this quote to end on. It's one of my favorite quotes. I do know that Angel and Williams are not capitalized. She does not capitalize them. This is by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, and one of the things that she has said in working as a Black Zen Buddhist practitioner is that learning to be with suffering is as an experience is part and parcel of what it means to live. And it radically alters our relationship to all of life and to the suffering of others. If you are invested in alleviating suffering, whether as an activist or a change maker or someone who's committed to life because you hear the cries of the world, it's important to understand that you can't even recognize the suffering of others without fully acknowledging the despair of your own suffering. It turns out that far from dragging you down, one of the most liberating things that you can do is to come to terms with the fact that some form of your suffering will always be there. To be present with that unhooks us from the constant anxiety of trying to make it go away. Paradoxically, once we release the proposition that we are going to get rid of the suffering, then the potential to alleviate the suffering becomes possible. Again, coming to terms with exploring our own limitations and unhooking us from it should be this way, I should be able to get this much done, I should be able to keep up with these certain demands, and coming back to the presence of honoring what the actual reality is.